whether it's before you buy a car or during the ownership, and there's normally at least one or two jobs that you find that are pretty common. They're actually an absolute pain to do, and one of these was the rear engine mount, and basically the vacuum mounts in general on the XC90. It's a Volvo thing. They're on a few different models. What didn't really fill me with confidence wasn't just looking online, but the fact that the Haynes manual in the section of remove an engine mount, it didn't seem to actually recognise the existence of the rear engine mount at all, never mind tell me how to remove it. So that was fun. The rear engine mounts are normally a pain on anything to get to, because you tend to have the rear of the subframe kind of in the way there, but reading online some of the guides people have written, they didn't exactly make this out to be a fun job, so not one I was exactly looking forward to doing. Nonetheless, I eventually got around to ordering some front and rear mounts. These are Corteco ones, which look pretty much the same as OE. They're not the cheapest of cheap on there and seem to get good reviews, so bought a set of them and got around to starting the job. First thing I did was stick the car up on axle stands, didn't take any wheels off, and just put a stand under each of the rear subframe mounts. And a little tip here, I have these little magnetic trays which are great for making sure nuts and bolts stay kind of grouped together and certainly don't go missing. First quick task though was to undo the under tray from under the engine. There's a few bolts on there, some of mine were 12 and 13, I don't think they're the original ones, a couple are missing, but quickly got those off and put them on my little magnetic tray. I'm going to do the front mount first, and with the bonnet open looking down, it's right at the front of the engine. You see those vacuum hoses going to it, and with the under tray off you can look under the front as well and see it just above the subframe there. And there's also a front lower torque mount that attaches from the gearbox onto the subframe, so we're going to need to remove that first before we can remove the front vacuum mount. There's two bolts on the side at the rear of the mount on the gearbox side. They're 14mm. You can only just about get to them with a spanner, so I couldn't really fit in a ratchet in here, but they're quite easy to do. There's two of those. Then the front two that bolt onto the subframe, they're 18mm. I was being lazy here and I used an impact gun, but they're not too hard to get off. And then I was able to put those bolts in one of my little magnetic trays and leave it just on the subframe. So back to the front vacuum mount. It was a 15mm socket on the top nut. I used quite a few extension bars for that to undo that, and then underneath it goes through that little hole in the subframe. There's a 14mm bolt that goes underneath the vacuum mount. So the mount should be free now, top and bottom, so you can pop the vacuum hose off the little nipple. And then I put a little rubber block for this, but where the mount was attached to the gearbox, that torque mount, I put the jack underneath there and lifted it up. And if you're slow and careful, you should start to see the engine lifting up and giving some clearance to the mount. So you don't want like 100% clearance on there. When you get to a certain point, you should be able to get your hand under there and then just sort of slip it out from underneath, like so, and then you can lift it just out the top. And now this is the comparison side by side. So that's the old one on the left and the new one on the right. You could tell the old one had collapsed a little bit because the actual kind of metal wire that went round the mount was quite loose, and the mount would looked pretty worn out. Because the old one had worn a little bit, it meant it was a little bit tighter getting the new one in, so I had to jack up a little bit more just to fit the new mount in. And then kind of like the opposite really, it was a case of slowly lowering down the jack, making sure that everything was seated properly, and making sure that this little vacuum hose part was coming through the hole nice and cleanly. And there we go, so that's in place now. And that's the new front engine mount in place, so as seen from underneath. And so the next thing to do is to take off the engine cover, and we're going to start to take off that torque bar at the rear. So it's a 17mm bolt on the top and then an 18mm nut underneath on the left and right hand side. So a little tip again here, I found my magnetic reach tool pretty useful because that nut didn't want to stay in place, it went flying off. Very useful tool, I've used it and referenced it in other videos. Then where it bolts through the bush in the middle is slightly different. It's an 18mm bolt with an 18mm nut, so a bit more consistent on there. And once you've undone all those, you can just lift off that stabiliser bar out the way. The engine mount itself is just to the right of the turbo at the back, so we can see it getting a bit closer in. Similar to the front one, there's a little vacuum nipple and there's a 15mm nut on the top, which again, lots of extension bars to get to that, and the magnetic tool to help me retrieve the nut, which inevitably fell off. And then with that nice and free at the top, it was time for the harder part, which is underneath. So you can see the engine mount there just behind the gearbox above the rear of the subframe. And unfortunately the lower nut or lower bolt isn't as easy to get to on the front because the anti-roll bar is in the way. So you can see here, you can see it just peeking between the anti-roll bar and the subframe. You can just about get a hand in there, but it's a very tight space. You can't get an awful lot of leverage on it. So there's no room for a ratchet under there. You might get away with one of the sort of like the wobbly attachments on a 3/8, but my 1/2 inch one certainly didn't fit in there. What I managed to do was get a ring spanner on there and then use another ring spanner on the end of that, just enough to crack it. But once I'd managed to crack the nut the initial time, it was quite loose. I could get my hand in there and slowly turn it, and you can see it here. So it's a spanner pointing towards the rear of the car, just above the exhaust, so there's quite a bit of room, but it is a bit further back as well behind the subframe. Pretty much same as the front then. I had to get the jack under a suitable place, a bit further back on the gearbox this time, and lift it all up. And then, as you can see there, I managed to get it high enough so that the engine mount was dangling, so it was mostly sort of staying up because of the little vacuum hose. Once I disconnected that, it would drop down quite easy. But despite some of the other videos showing it differently, I didn't have enough space, no matter how much I jacked up or lowered the engine, to get it out any other way than over the top of the prop shaft and then back towards the sort of the rear of the car over the end of the subframe. So it's pretty much the way my hand went in to get the spanner on the lower bolt. So with the old and the new side by side, you can see some damage on the old one, which is on the right. The cable fell off. I guess it was compressed that much because it hadn't split, and the heat shield was pretty dirty, so I decided to clean that all up quite nicely, ready for the new mount to go back on. So when you're putting the new mount in, don't put the plastic nipple on there. You can do that afterwards, it's much easier, but you have to feed it in pretty much the same way. So through the rear of the subframe to the engine side of the prop shaft. Then you might have to lower the jack and pass it over the prop shaft, and then it'll be roughly in place. And what I had to do next was I put the top of the mount, so like the thread and the vacuum hose bit, up through into the kind of gearbox side of the mount, and then with my other hand I slowly lowered the engine and gearbox back down, guiding it into place, being very careful not to drop my hand or anything. 2 hands involved, couldn't film it, but I managed to get it in place, and then I kind of, using my finger force, stick my hand back through and got that bolt started off in the bottom of the mount. For this next bit I pretty much had to mount the engine, so I got up and sort of kneeled on top of the engine and got the nut first of all back on the top of the engine mount, got that nice and tight, and then it was a case of getting that plastic elbow back into the vacuum port. A little bit tricky because you have to go like through the top of the engine mount, there's a little cavity in there, and then try and feed it in, and it's quite a pain to get into place, but I managed to do that eventually. So then it was a case of putting stuff back together. So the upper torque mount bar went back on, and the engine cover, the lower torque mount went back on, and tightened everything up. And then I went back underneath and just double checked that the rear mount bolt was tight. As you can see it there in its position. So that vacuum system is part of both the boost control and the general vacuum system on the engine. So one of the symptoms you get, sort of like a vacuum leak or the engine mount's failing, is kind of like a popping noise when the oil cap's off. So the last thing really was to start the engine up and check that. You still do get a popping noise of sorts, like so. But that's kind of like acceptable levels. It's a lot quieter than it would be if there was an engine vacuum leak, and that's a normal amount of noise. And as an added little bonus, at the time when I was trying to diagnose this, I actually disconnected the engine mounts from the vacuum system to try and figure out the cause, and I did block off the hose from the solenoid with a little bolt, and And so just to kind of cover off all bases, I remade all of the vacuum hoses with new silicone hose to put back together. So the date on the existing ones did say 2004, so this is kind of 17 years old by this point for the rubber. So I've replaced those for fresh as well. It's really cheap to get silicone hose. You can see it on eBay, match up the inner diameter and swap them over while you're there, really, for a more thorough job. But yeah, that was about it. I took it for a quick test drive after this just to make sure, and the symptoms that I actually had for this, there was no engine light, although you can get an engine light with a vacuum leak, but I was getting a lot of clunking as I was changing gear and as the engine was obviously moving forwards and backwards. So I took it for a quick spin and all that has gone. So well worth doing, and hopefully with these mounts it's kind of like the last time this car will probably need it. Not a difficult job, or nowhere near as difficult as I was expecting it to be, but you have to judge that based on your own abilities. The front one I did in like minutes, probably like 15 minutes from start to getting the new one in there. The rear one was a little bit more tricky just because of that access to the lower bolt and fiddling around upwards and downwards with the jack, just trying to get the space to get the mount out of the way. But no, otherwise it's well worth doing. You can do it as you see there. You can do it on the driveway yourself if you've got a jack and a bit of space and time.